Hi everyone, this is Dr. Giobbi coming to you with a presentation of material that we're covering on Chapter 8, Behavioral Counseling. I like this quote by Howard Gardner. Gardner is an individual who took a more comprehensive look at personality and intelligence and developed a theory, an entire theory of his own about society and the individual. But nevertheless, Gardner says, when all else fails, I become a behaviorist. This is an interesting quote to consider. He's not saying my first go-to approach is behaviorism. He's actually saying the opposite of this. His last approach, when everything else doesn't work, then he goes to behaviorism. This is an interesting statement, and I have feelings about the behavioral approach that are similar that seem to me to be similar to what Howard Gardner is presenting here. When all else fails, I become a behaviorist. I think from the outset of this presentation of Chapter 8, I'd like to tell you that I have found that the techniques of behaviorism, that is, operant and classical conditioning, and the various modes of behavioral modification that come along with those two broad areas of behaviorism, learning theory. I find them to be very effective. I also find that there's a certain problem that has manifested that was actually predicted many years ago when behaviorism became in vogue after 1913 with the psychological, I guess we could call it, obsession with being taken seriously as a science. There's always been this laboratory psychology, academic psychology, that has had an uncomfortable relationship with clinical counseling psychology. And behaviorism is at the forefront of this discomfort. Usually therapists and counselors traditionally have been less concerned with being scientific and being more concerned with practicality, with what works with a patient, with a client. And behaviorism was really a marked insurrection in this attitude, where today you probably the majority of your classes are maybe obsessively promoting psychology's scientific authority. However, as we have seen in humanism and psychodynamic theory and some of the other depth psychologies, and as we'll see more coming up, there's often lip service to by psychotherapists today, clinical psychologists today, and counselors today, to this idea of science being the ultimate authority, and this is maybe touted to give psychotherapy a certain imprimatur, a certain clout, a certain validity to the layperson. But in actuality, this stuff is it's usually held with skepticism by most therapists, who know that much of the human condition is too complicated to be reduced to these ideals of behaviorism. We can begin by discussing some of the big names of behaviorism. That's B.F. Skinner. He wanted to be a writer, found he didn't have anything to say, so he became an experimental psychologist, not a therapist. B.F. Skinner went on to really apply operant conditioning reward and punishment schedules, to child rearing and child therapy. We also have John B. Watson, who, after he did his little Albert study and after his fall from grace with academic psychology, when he had an affair with a graduate student who he later married. He divorced his wife and married this graduate student. He was then blacklisted from academic life, so he became a popularizer of psychology and also went into advertising. And he wrote many articles for popular magazines on behavioral techniques, mostly classical conditioning, like he did with the Little Albert study, for child rearing. So I've put some videos up of both Skinner and his Skinner crib that his daughter was actually raised in. She wrote a book about her experience growing up as the daughter of B.F. Skinner. And I also put a video up of the original research with Little Albert that was done at the University of Chicago. And so these are important figures, Skinner and Watson. Skinner being the representative of operant conditioning, that's what you know as reward and punishment schedules, or reinforcement and punishment schedules, as the behaviorists like to say, and John B. Watson, who is the classical conditioning guy. So be aware of those two and the lineage and the history. Now here's the interesting aspect that I'd like to discuss about behaviorism. All of the techniques you're going to read about, operant techniques, operant conditioning techniques, classical conditioning techniques, flooding, habit formation, new habit forming, all of these things, all of the techniques were outlined and discussed long before behaviorism existed. Behaviorism did not enter anything new into the conversation. Everything that you'll study here today was discussed long before John B. Watson was alive by William James. 1899, William James wrote his book, Talks to Teachers about Psychology. He also wrote his Principles of Psychology, and in there you will find all the techniques used by behaviorists. Around the same time, John Dewey, the American educational pragmatist, discussed all of these theories, but did not refer to them as behaviorism. And this is the key aspect. In 1913, with the Behaviorist Manifesto, and today with behavioral counseling, behavioral therapy, and what they call behavior specialists, you will find a very systematized, very control-oriented, a very outcome-concerned, measurement, control, change concerned group of individuals. It's almost as if behaviorism took these principles that existed before behaviorism was a thing, as outlined by James and others for many, many years, even going back to the ancient Greeks, these techniques were discussed. But behaviorism became kind of like a science cult. It's called positivism. Positivism is a type of psychologist who is maybe worshiping at the altar of science, that is not so interested perhaps in what works, but more interested in what is true and from a scientific viewpoint. Now, I'm going to say that these ideas are very powerful and they are effective, especially when you're dealing with animals. So these techniques that you're going to learn about in this chapter are used primarily by dog trainers and by animal trainers. Behaviorism works very well with animals. As a matter of fact, you'll read that one of the core concepts of behaviorism, one of the core principles of behaviorism, is that human beings are animals, and that human beings share this evolutionary continuity, that human behavior and animal behavior is identical. That's called evolutionary continuity. It's one of the core principles of behaviorism, along with empiricism, that nothing is known before it's experienced, and determinism, that everything works in a stimulus response, cause and effect manner, and reductionism, that the more you break something down into a smaller part, the better you can find its causal relationship, its cause and effect relationship. So these principles of evolutionary continuity, reductionism, determinism, and empiricism are at the core of what the behaviorist believes. As you see, that lends individuals to take a certain view, individuals who embrace behaviorism, a certain view of humans. And this is what we're seeing in this slide, the nature of people. People are essentially born neutral with equal potential for good and evil and rationality and irrationality. Behaviorist view, so that's the tabula rasa, the blank slate. That's the empiricism. Empiricism means things come through experience. Behaviorists view people as responders and products of conditioning. So like billiard balls, or like behavioral economics, that's also popular today. Human beings are seen as cause and effect relationships with their environment. And things that happen to children influence and change them as biological beings. So things that occur in the environment affect the child's behavior, change the environment, change the behavior. The stimulus response, this was called S-R psychology in its heyday. Stimulus response paradigm, people react in predictable ways to any given stimulus according to what they have learned through experience. Behavior is learned and can be unlearned, and behavioral counselor concerned with this unlearning or re-education process, re-education. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, or read the book. But the film A Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick is a cultural criticism. It's a critique of behaviorism. This is a movie that takes place in the future when behaviorism has come to be the gold standard for therapy, for how to live, for the judicial system, and that's the clockwork, the mechanism. As you see, this is a very mechanical type of worldview. And the orange is this succulent, beautiful, tasty, rich thing that's alive. That's what the symbolism of the clockwork and the orange is. And you'll see from that film, or that book, if you decide to read it, it's a great criticism of behaviorism. Now, the interesting thing is, when this book was written in the 1960s and the movie made in the 1970s, it was seen as something that maybe had outlived itself, behaviorism. But we today see behaviorism, again, as the gold standard for many children, and in particular, low-functioning children and low-functioning adults. Now, we need to really be careful and be clear that we're talking here not about, we're going to talk about the efficacy. What I'm alerting you to is that these are very effective methods, and they can be very useful for young children who have not yet developed insight or depth, ability to think in depth, awareness. And it's also very effective for older adults and older children whom have limited intellectual capacity or maybe a nonverbal. It's very big today. Where the caution that I'm going to caution comes in is when when you meet or train to be a behavior therapist, or when you meet a behavioral specialist, you'll notice a certain very shallow and narrow worldview might be present with the individuals. And I would propose to you that this is probably due to a narrowness and shallowness of study and reading. If you go to a program that only teaches, if you go to a program that teaches behavioral counseling, behavioral specialist, that is going to be limited to that library, that set of texts that only focuses on behavioral techniques, and it almost becomes, I'll be a little controversial and say almost like cult-like. It becomes the worldview of the individual, and I think that's dangerous. When a behavioral specialist ceases to see behaviorism as a tool, in the words of Howard Gardner, a last resort tool, and begins to see view the world as a behaviorist, it becomes dogmatic. The dogma becomes dogmatic. It becomes fundamentalist, and I think it becomes shallow. And you will see individuals who, as is outlined in this chapter, individuals who are very concerned with checklists and very concerned with outcomes and rubrics and things of this nature. It's a very taskmaster-ish, as we say, bean counter type approach. That's the danger. Falling into this as the way of seeing the world, I think, is dangerous. In my experience, when you read William James, who was not a behaviorist, but described all the techniques of behaviorism before behaviorism was behaviorism in that 1899 text, Talk to Teachers, and his 1898 Principles of Psychology. When you read James, he uses these techniques to illustrate more human, orange, lifelike concepts. With behaviorism, the techniques serve the ideology of scientific psychology, to be taken seriously in white lab coats and flow charts and check boxes and statistical formulas. So keep that in mind. The theory of counseling, from a Skinnerian point of view, is very straightforward. Positive stimulus, so rewards and praise, will increase a behavior. Negative stimulus, so anything that's unpleasant, will decrease the preceding behavior. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the positive reinforcement, an example. One of my most profound contact with behavioral specialist came when, as a musician, a piano teacher, a parent called me and asked if I would give music lessons to their nonverbal, severely autistic child. And after some consideration, I decided to do this, to participate in this. And I was informed that the child would be accompanied at every lesson by their behavioral specialist. This was a person who had a degree in behavioral counseling and accompanied the child to keep them on task, in this case, piano lessons. So this is what I took from this experience. I noticed when the behavioral counselor came into the music studio, she was carrying a cup of Cookie Crisp cereal. And to get the child to do anything, to do any type of behavior that she wanted, she would show him a Cookie Crisp and then tell him what to do. Hang your coat up. And if she showed that, then gave a Cookie Crisp. Sit down at the piano, Cookie Crisp. Shake the teacher's hand, Cookie Crisp. So everything was done in the similar fashion of training a dog with dried salmon to do tricks or to behave, to know when to sit. Give the dog sits, give him the salmon reward. I had great experience in spending time with dog trainers. So I immediately saw this in a very interesting way. I saw that it was effective. The young man sat down next to me, the behavior therapist on one side, myself at the other, and I would point at a key to play. The student would then play the note and get a Cookie Crisp. I would then play the first note again and then the second note of a tune, say Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And when the student played 2 notes, they got another Cookie Crisp. You see, this is positive reinforcement. When the student didn't play the correct notes or in the correct rhythmic pattern or didn't play, they didn't get the positive reinforcement. Now, over the course of, I would say, about 2 months, the child actually learned to peck out the tune Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with lots of Cookie Crisp. And in that time, I did a lot of observing. I observed, and I had conversation with the behavioral specialist. And this is what I found. In my experience, this has been the standard interaction I've had with behavioral specialists. Firstly, the behavioral specialist had very limited ability to discuss anything except behaviorism. As a psychologist, I was discussing different things in psychology, and there was the sense that there was no knowledge beyond behaviorism and behavioral techniques. There was also a very emphasized, maybe overemphasized sense of authority or expertise that I found to be reckless simply because the person wasn't well-rounded in their therapeutic techniques. In other words, they knew what worked, but they didn't know the criticisms of the technique they were using. And secondly, what I found was the most amazing part of the lesson that I experienced had nothing to do with the child pecking out Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for an extrinsic reward, the Cookie Crisp. What I found was a severely autistic, nonverbal student who would become overjoyed and cry and even hug me when I would play music for him at the piano. This young child would put his hands on my hands as I played and hold them on certain chords that he wanted to continue to listen to. And he would then do the customary flapping of his hands and exhibit joy and such blissful exuberance from listening to the music. And he'd hug me. Now, this is an individual who did not participate in social interaction such as hugging unless there was a reward schedule with a Cookie Crisp. And suddenly, the behaviorist, I would imagine, viewed this as the reward being the music instead of the Cookie Crisp. But I think something deeper was occurring here. And what the deep thing that was happening was that this child was laying his face on the piano and listening for the moment that the sound and the silence met after a chord was sounded. And he would listen for this and be so moved and express such joy at this. Now, the behaviorist is going to interpret this as the music was the reward, just displacing the Cookie Crisp. I find that to be very unsatisfying. What I noticed, what I observed, was that through spontaneous, authentic music making, the child had an emotional response. Now, as you will understand with with behaviorism and in psychology, that um, emotion plays no role in the therapy. Emotion is not a factor. Two basic emotions, maybe three, but two are usually emphasized: pleasure and unpleasure. This is what Freud called the pleasure principle. And again, long before John B. Watson, Freud outlined the whole classical and operant conditioning in the pleasure principle, that the child goes from experiences either pleasure or unpleasure, and that this can be used to manipulate behavior. Emotion is not discussed because it's not observable or measurable. Behavior is observable and measurable. So if we break this down into the smaller part, the antecedent is the stimulus. The behavior is what the patient says or does, and the consequence is the result of the behavior. And this is what they call behavior analysis. So they look at a behavior, and they look to see what they analyze this ABC, the stimulus, the response, and the consequence, and they look to see how a stimulus can be either eliminated or added to alter the behavior. This has nothing to do with will. This has nothing to do with emotion or thought. It's simply viewing as an evolutionary continuity as an animal response, a base animal response. So the behavior analysts love checklists, and they love procedures, especially when there's numbers involved with them. And if you look on page 251 and on this slide, you're going to see this, the process it's called. So number one, identify the problem, performing a task or dealing with people. And this can be very useful in learning something new, such as piano technique or memorization. But when it comes to the emotional or the expressive aspects of music, all bets are off. So identify the problem or performing the task. Maybe that's playing a piece on the piano or having social interaction with others. Identify the problem type. Is the person unable or are they unwilling? Now, there's a difference between unable or unwilling. Unable, they might have to learn learn an ability to be able to do something. Unwilling is, that's dangerous business for behaviorists, because they start to talk about willfulness. In other words, desire to do something. That's emotional states. So they identify if they're unable or unwilling. Most behaviorists will see things as unwillingness to do something, and then as we'll see, find a way to motivate unwilling to willing through a positive reinforcement, cookie crisp, in other words. Determinism is the cause of problem, lack of knowledge or obstacle or refusal. So refusal is a big one here. Select the appropriate solution. So is that one of the different methods that you'll see. Now, if you look on page 251, you're going to see 8 steps that are outlined in the process. And I'm not going to go through all of these because you can read this on your own, but you will see that this is a very systematic approach. So when you're talking about operant conditioning, this would be like giving the cookie crisp. That's to promote a certain behavior. Behavior that's wanted, playing middle C is desired, get a cookie crisp when they play the middle C. If you continuously give them cookie crisp, they'll lose interest in playing that middle C, because they know every time they press that note, they'll get the cookie crisp, they'll get the reinforcement. But if you only give it that if you start out that way, it's fine. But then when you cut back and you only give it intermittently, only occasionally when they play the C, it'll really promote that behavior. The child, as a matter of fact, this child that I'm speaking of would repeatedly play the note out of context rapidly. So if they were supposed to play just this, and then they get a Cookie Crisp, they would start playing this over and over again, hoping to get the Cookie Crisp for playing that note, when in fact that would be the ultimate goal, that the child would learn, but they would just hit one key out of context. So you would have to be selective of, then you'd give Cookie Crisp. Cookie Crisp after they repeat that, etc. And that is what they call it, breaking up the big goal of playing the whole piece down into these little pieces. So you can schedule this reinforcement that it comes maybe every third time they play it correctly, or every 10 minutes or something like this. And these are just intervals, schedules of reinforcement that you're seeing. So in doing this, the goal is to teach the client to be their own counselors by changing their behavior to better fit their needs. I'm not so convinced that this is what a behaviorist actually believes, that they become their own counselors. I think that they learn to avoid unpleasure and seek out pleasure based on the reward and punishment schedules. And if you stop reinforcing it long enough, it'll become extinct. They'll forget, and you'll have to re-Cookie Crisp them up. After the problem has been identified, changed, agreed on, this is to give the idea that there's some willfulness, agreed on, that you're not forcing them to do something they don't want to do. Variety of procedures to help the client acquire the behaviors necessary to solve the problem. Another very scientific talk here, serious stuff. Goal equals overt change. So seeing a change in behavior is the goal. The counseling methods. So I want to go through some of these counseling methods with you. Again, this is going to be in reaction to feeling that there's something being forced upon the client. A contingency contract is when the client participates in observing the problem. This is not going to frequently happen with low functioning people or adults or with little children. They just don't have the insight to be able to understand the idea of problem. They just know comfort and discomfort. So the counselor collects baseline data. So this is science talk, collecting data, baseline. This is, in other words, a very scientific approach. They then set the goals. They develop a plan to target the behavior and reinforcement, to go through this operant conditioning. Say, like, even a great thing that's very effective with young children is the little gold star charts, behavior charts. Every day that they practice piano, say, I'm using piano music lesson examples because it is what I've noticed things in this nature very, very much in the past. So they develop a plan for the target behavior using reinforcement. So the gold star, if you practice every day, you get a gold star. And then at the end of the week, if you have 7 gold stars for practicing a half hour a day, maybe there's some reinforcement given. And counselor evaluates a plan, so there has to always be a plan, a very written out systematic plan. If plan is not effective, repeat 4. Go back to the beginning. You see how systematic this is. Very systematic. It's a step-by-step process. Define the problem, collect data, introduce treatment, etc. So let's look at some of these methods. What I described to you as the child coming in and you play, and then they play, and they get a cookie crisp, a reinforcer. Then you play, and they play, they get a reinforcer. Then you play, and they play, they don't get a reinforcer, so you keep doing it. They get the reinforcer. You see, after 2 months, they can play the whole thing. That's called shaping, taking a little piece at a time. It's called shaping. The counselor looks for desired behavior, waits till it occurs, and reinforces it when it does occur. Again, this is very similar to training animals, training a dog. Behavioral momentum. Make easy requests with high compliance possibilities. So make things easy and small, little bites. This is like taking little bites rather than big spoonfuls. Save the work up to more difficult things that low compliance means things they don't want to do. This is science talk. Low compliance, it means they don't want to do it. It's an emotion. Sometimes they use biofeedback, which is using machinery to measure brain waves, heart rate, blood pressure. You can get these biofeedback machines online. And again, biology, heart rate, blood pressure, brain waves, it's all measurable and observable. So it fits into the ideology of behaviorism. Small changes in behavior, and you work forward from there. Another way is of using behavioral techniques. This is actually more of social cognitive behavioral psychology, is modeling. That's when you expose the client to individuals exhibiting the target behavior. So maybe I, as the teacher, sit down and go, and then eventually the child, by watching this, will model it. Modeling works well when you approach the instrument. A lot of little children, especially children with troubles like this, even emotional troubles, they pound on the instrument. They'll want to really hit it and stuff like this, and you teach by demonstrating to be gentle on the instrument, modeling it, and then eventually you can maybe the child, by just watching, will begin to model and take up this behavior. That usually works with more simplistic things. It's interesting. I find myself in having to talk about this behaviorism and check boxes and all of these systematic approaches. I have to go to the piano and play a little bit to kind of refresh my soul. Token economy. This used to work great on the psychiatric unit with adults. You could control all the unruly psychiatric patients by withholding their cigarette break from them. They get like 15 minutes twice a day to have a cigarette, and most of these people, these adults, were cigarette smokers. So if they'd start to misbehave or not be agreeable or do willful things that you don't want them to do, you'd say, well, you're going to lose your cigarette break, where you could give them a little token every time. It's the token economy, a little plastic coin every time they were agreeable, did something you asked them to do, and this would, like the behavioral chart, it's like a gold star, lead up to the behavior you were looking for long-term reinforcements. Behavior practice groups. This is when the young children get together and demonstrate for each other how to act in front of other people, how to do social interaction, things of this nature. And then they're reinforced by being praised in front of the group, getting awards. Role playing is another. Get the child to act. I used role playing once with a young child in piano lessons. This is why I'm telling you the stuff works. However, be very careful about it, adopting this behaviorist worldview. I think that's where the problem starts. So I've used many of these techniques myself. Role playing, what did we do? Well, the child was coming in and they weren't treating the instrument as they should be. They were very young yet. This was like at age 7. A child started lessons at age 6. And they were still occasionally doing these things on the piano, which when they get older could be very brilliant tone clusters. But that's not what we were after. We were after treating the piano, the instrument, correctly, well, with respect, and etc. So I told the child, as role playing, I told the child that I had a young student starting lessons, a new student, and would they help me to write a book teaching the new student how to act at piano lessons, how to practice, how to teach how to treat the piano, etc. So this little child and I sat down and wrote together a children's book that he drew the pictures to, that said you should never bang on the piano, you should always be at your lesson on time, never play the piano when another person's talking, when the teacher's talking, etc. Be respectful, practice every day, all these basic things. And it was actually getting him to play the role that I was hoping to cultivate in himself, under the belief that it was for this younger student than him. So he played the role of an older student or even a teacher. Assertiveness training, encouraging to recognize one's own rights and those of other individuals. I'm not so convinced this is what behaviorism is about. Behaviorism, in my sense, is about getting people to comply with getting a client to comply with what you want them to do, not to do what they want to do. So this is, classical conditioning is the other aspect of behavioral learning. This is when a neutral stimulus, unlike the operant conditioning, which is operational, where that you see a target behavior that you want to increase and you reward it, or you see a target behavior you want to decrease and you punish it. Neutral stimulus is, in classical conditioning, if you recall from Pavlov and John B. Watson, neutral stimulus is paired with another stimulus. After repeated pairing of stimuli, then the neutral stimulus elicits the same response as other stimulus. So how can you get this to happen? Well, this is simple. In piano lessons, I can tell you how it's done. If you set an atmosphere in the piano lessons that's very embracing, very positive, very pleasurable for them, they then relate piano lessons with pleasure and joy and bliss, and it motivates them to want to come to feel that. The young child with the very severe nonverbal autism would love to come to lessons, not for the cookie crisp, because he could get that doing something else, but he got something at lessons that was quite unique, and that was I would play the piano for him, and he could lay underneath the grand piano and feel the vibrations on his skin and listen to the music and be moved emotionally, or place his hands on mine while I played. And that was pairing this physical bliss he was experiencing, this joy, with being at the piano. And that, folks, I think is the big lesson here, because regardless of one's intellectual capacity, that's what the bliss of life is about. Finding the joy in doing things and experiencing that. And you can call it classical conditioning. You can call it a pairing of a biological and physiological states of pleasure with an activity. And I think that ultimately is the value of the behavioral techniques. So I think with that, we will conclude this lecture, and you can please take behaviorism as a very powerful set of tools. But please heed my warning of becoming caught up in the worldview of the behaviorist.